Taiwan's Aerospace Industrial Development Corporation walked onto a stage in Taichung on June 1, 2026, and unveiled a piece of hardware that was not supposed to exist for another 5 years. It is a drone navigation system that does not use the Global Positioning Service. Take a second on that sentence, because it is the single most consequential sentence I am going to say in the next 20 minutes. A drone navigation system that does not use GPS. The single largest vulnerability of every Western unmanned aerial system fielded over the last 2 decades, the dependency that the Russian Korsuka jammers exploited over Donbass, that the Iranian electronic warfare networks exploited over the Gulf, that the Chinese GPS spoofing trials at Shanghai Harbor demonstrated in 2019, and that every PLA strategic supports planning document since has assumed would be exploited again in a Taiwan Strait scenario. Taiwan just removed that vulnerability, publicly, with cameras present, with the model designation announced, with a public timeline for fleet integration. This is Professor Stephen. The story you are about to hear is not actually about a drone. It is about the moment that 3 previously separate maritime theaters, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea, formally fused into one continuous strategic surface with one continuous deterrent calculation and one continuous risk that nobody in Beijing's threat assessment process was prepared to confront on the timeline. It is now confronting them on Taiwan. Subscribe right now, because what happened in the last 10 days in the Western Pacific is the kind of thing analysts are going to be reverse engineering for years. And most of the mainstream coverage so far has reported it as 3 small, isolated stories instead of one large, connected one. Let me start with the navigation system itself, because the technical story is where the strategic story comes from. The standard military drone, and this includes American MQ-9 Reapers, Turkish Bayraktars, the Iranian Shad variants, and most of the Chinese Winglungs, relies on a GPS receiver to know where it is in 3-dimensional space at any given moment. If the GPS signal is jammed, spoofed, or denied, the drone falls back on an inertial measurement unit, which is essentially a set of accelerometers and gyroscopes that can dead recon for a short period, but accumulates error rapidly. After 90 minutes of dead reckoning, even a high-end inertial unit can be off-target by hundreds of meters. After 3 hours, kilometers. That is the vulnerability the Chinese Strategic Support Force has been building electronic warfare doctrine around since 2018, when its first dedicated GPS denial brigades reached operational capability per the United States Department of Defense's 2020 China Military Power Report. Taiwan's AIDC system combines 3 things to remove that dependency. The first is visual simultaneous localization and mapping, the technology you have probably seen used inside autonomous vacuum robots and Tesla Autopilot, but militarized. The drone uses high-resolution downward-facing cameras to recognize terrain features in real time and match them against an onboard map. The second is a high-precision inertial measurement unit derived, per AIDC's published technical brief, from the same Honeywell licensed sensor family that the United States Navy uses on its undersea platforms. That eliminates most of the dead reckoning drift. The third is terrain contour matching, a technology that originally came out of the United States Tomahawk cruise missile program in the 1970s, which compares the actual terrain the drone is flying over against a stored digital elevation model and adjusts continuously. None of these 3 technologies is new on its own. What is new is the integration into a low-cost airframe at low enough unit cost to be fielded at fleet scale on a timeline that AIDC's CEO Hu Kai-hung publicly stated will see the first 200 units delivered to the Republic of China Air Force by the 4th quarter of 2026. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published a brief on June 3rd, 2 days after the unveiling, calling the AIDC system, and I am quoting Bonnie Lin, who runs CSIS's China Power Project, the first publicly demonstrated full GPS-independent navigation stack at fleet deployable cost. That phrase is full GPS-independent navigation stack at fleet deployable cost is the operational description that matters. Other militaries have built one-off GPS-independent prototypes. The United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has a half-dozen of them sitting in test programs at Edwards Air Force Base. Nobody has fielded one as a fleet platform that an entire Air Force can fly into a contested electromagnetic environment without losing situational awareness. Now, 5 days earlier, on May 28, 2026, a Dutch Navy frigate named HNL-MS De Ruyter, a De Zeven Provinciën-class air defense frigate, transited the Paracel Islands as part of a freedom of navigation operation. The Paracel Islands are a contested archipelago in the South China Sea that Beijing claims as sovereign territory and that has been the subject of multiple American FONOPs since 2015. The People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command mobilized assets to monitor dayriders' transit. Chinese state media called it a provocation. The Dutch Ministry of Defense, in a press release dated May 29th, said simply that the transit was conducted in accordance with international law and was part of routine operations supporting the rules-based maritime order in the Indo-Pacific. Let me explain why the Dutch transit is much more consequential than its modest press coverage has reflected. For the last decade, freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea have been overwhelmingly an American show. The USS Decatur, the USS Lassen, the USS Curtis Wilbur, the USS Muston, all American destroyers, all under American command, all operating under the political and reputational mantle of the United States Navy. Beijing's standard reaction has been to denounce the FOONOP as American hegemony, to frame the South China Sea dispute as a bilateral matter between China and the United States, and to publicly position the rest of the world as bystanders to a great power dispute they have no stake in. That positioning is the foundation of Beijing's entire diplomatic theater of operations in the region. A Dutch frigate flips that positioning. The Netherlands is a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Netherlands is a member of the European Union. The Netherlands has no significant historical or military role in the Western Pacific, no colonial-era residual claims, no strategic interest in the islands themselves. When a Dutch frigate transits the Paracels, the message to Beijing is not the message that an American destroyer carries. The message is that the rules-based maritime order in the Indo-Pacific is no longer an American project that the rest of the world is reluctantly tolerating. It is a project that NATO members are willing to send hulls to enforce without American supervision, without American command, and without American political cover. That is a substantially worse strategic environment for Beijing than the one Beijing was operating in 12 months ago. The Dutch Van Troep is the first NATO-flagged transit through the Paracels in the modern era. It is unlikely to be the last. The German Bundesmarine's frigate Baden-Württemberg has a scheduled deployment to the Indo-Pacific later this year. The French Marine Nationale surveillance frigate Vendée Miard has run 2 Taiwan Strait transits since 2019. Now let me close the geographic triangle with the third corner, which is where the 3 Seas linkage thesis comes from. The South China Morning Post on May 21, 2026, published a report on a study by the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, a Beijing-affiliated think tank whose annual external risk assessment is widely read inside the Chinese policy community. The 2026 edition of that assessment, for the first time in the Institute's history, placed Taiwan Strait tensions at number 1 on China's list of external risks for the year, above the trade war with the United States, above the technology decoupling, above the war in Ukraine and its impact on Sino-Russian alignment. Number 1. The American Enterprise Institute's China analysts, in a brief that picked up the SCMP report and contextualized it, noted that this is the first time since the Institute began publishing its External Risk Index in 2008 that any single regional security issue has occupied the top slot. Climate, energy, finance, technology. None of them. Taiwan Strait. What that means in practice is that the People's Republic of China's own strategic intellectuals are now formally telling the Politburo in writing that the Taiwan Strait is China's most acute external vulnerability for the year, not its most acute opportunity, not its most acute leverage, its most acute vulnerability. That is a measurable shift in Beijing's own self-assessment, and it has happened in the same 6-month window in which Taiwan's Air Force just announced GPS-independent drone navigation and NATO members just started running their own FO through Chinese claimed waters. Let me catch myself here, because I have seen this format misused, and I do not want to oversell what I am about to say. Xi Jinping has been described as on the verge of invading Taiwan by Western media for approximately 10 years. The 2021 Admiral Davidson testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee put the window at 6 years, meaning a 2027 invasion. The 2027 invasion? The 2023 Admiral Aquilino testimony adjusted that to, the threat is closer than most think. The 2024 Robert O'Brien Essays in Foreign Affairs said the timeline had moved up. The 2025 think tank consensus papers from Brookings, CSIS, and RAND all said variations of the same thing. The analytical community in Washington has been predicting an imminent Taiwan crisis since approximately 2016, and we have not seen one. Either the analytical community has been wrong for 10 years, or the Taiwanese deterrent has been more effective than the analytical community gave it credit for. Or she is operating on a longer time horizon than Western analysts have been able to model. I do not know which of those three explanations is correct. I want to be honest about that. What I do know is that the AIDC announcement, the Dutch transit, and the Shanghai think tank's reclassification of the strait as the top external risk are three independent data points from three independent institutions, all converging on the same picture in the same 10-day window. When three independent data sources converge, you take the convergence seriously even if you have been burned by false alarms before. The 3Cs thesis is structural, not predictive. It says that prior to 2026, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea operated as three semi-separate problems for Beijing. The Senkaku Islands dispute with Japan in the East China Sea was its own contained crisis. The Taiwan Strait was its own contained crisis. The Spratlys and Paracels were their own contained crisis. China's military posture, diplomatic messaging, and political risk management were calibrated separately for each. The strategic genius of that separation, from Beijing's point of view, was that no single adversary could mobilize a coalition that touched all three at once. Japan worried about Senkaku and stayed out of the Spratlys. The Philippines worried about the Spratlys and stayed out of Taiwan. Taiwan worried about the strait and could not project into the East China Sea. Let me put one more concrete piece of evidence into that picture because the 3Cs linkage is not just rhetorical. There is now actual hardware moving across the boundaries between the three theaters in ways that did not exist before. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force in late April announced that it would deploy two of its Type 12 surface-to-ship missile batteries from Kyushu to Ishigaki Island, which sits less than 200 kilometers from the eastern coast of Taiwan and roughly the same distance from the Senkakus. That deployment formally fuses Japan's East China Sea posture with its Taiwan Strait posture under a single missile umbrella. The Philippines, in March, granted the United States expanded basing access at three additional Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites under the EDCA framework, two of which are positioned in northern Luzon facing the Bashi Channel, meaning the choke point between the South China Sea and the Pacific that any Chinese amphibious force attacking Taiwan would have to operate within range of. Australia, in May, made the Royal Australian Navy's Hobart-class destroyers Sydney and Hobart available for joint operations under what the Defense Minister Richard Marles described as the framework for sustained presence operations across the first island chain. None of those three deployments existed in their current form 12 months ago. All three deployments are individually modest. Collectively, they constitute a fused order of battle that operates across all three previously separate theaters as a single integrated front. There is also a piece of economic evidence that belongs in this picture. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, manufactures, by the World Semiconductor Trade Statistics estimate published in March, approximately 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips, the chips that go into every iPhone, every advanced data center accelerator, every modern automotive computer, every PLA precision-guided munitions guidance computer. A blockade of the Taiwan Strait does not just hurt Taiwan. It freezes the global semiconductor supply chain inside 72 hours. The Boston Consulting Group estimated in a 2021 study that a year-long disruption of TSMC's output would cost the global economy roughly $1 trillion in direct GDP loss. That number is now closer to $1.5 trillion per the same group's 2025 update, which means that when Beijing's own Shanghai Institute places the Taiwan Strait at number 1 on the external risk index, it is not just naming a political risk. It is naming the global economic risk, whose blast radius is largest, and acknowledging publicly that its own country has the largest single hand on the trigger. Beijing's own intellectuals are telling Beijing, in writing, that the country which can do the most damage to the global economy in 2026 is, on a strict probability-weighted basis, the People's Republic of China. That is an extraordinary public admission from a system that does not usually make admissions of that kind. What changed in the last 6 months is that the three theaters now share three pieces of common infrastructure that they did not share before. They share Taiwanese GPS-independent drones, which can operate across all three seas regardless of which one Beijing chooses to jam. They share NATO-flagged hulls running freedom of navigation operations, which means a single coalition of Western democracies' enforcement regime now spans the entire Western Pacific, and they share. And this is the piece that connects to the manpaths to Iran story. A single Chinese policy reality, which is that Beijing is now publicly running offensive operations elsewhere on the planet. The April F-15E Strike Eagle shootdown over Iran, which CNN's intelligence sources have linked to a Chinese-manufactured FN-16 MANPAS, was a strategic signal that China is willing to provide kinetic capability to revisionist powers in active conflict with the United States. That signal lands inside Tokyo's defense ministry, inside Manila's, inside Taipei's, and inside Canberra's. Every capital in the first island chain just got told by Beijing's own actions that the calculus has changed. Let me bring this back to your wallet for a moment, because I do not want this story to sit in the abstract. If the Taiwan Strait closes, and to be clear, closes means even a quarantine short of a full invasion, your iPhone, your laptop, your car's infotainment chip, your refrigerator's control board, and the data center that runs your bank's mobile app are all dependent on Taiwanese silicon. The most advanced chips do not have a second source. There is no alternative supplier at the leading process node. The Arizona TSMC fab that came online in 2024 is producing 4nm chips for late-cycle iPhone deployments, but the 3nm and the upcoming 2nm process nodes, the ones that AI accelerators and the next 2 generations of premium handsets depend on, are still made exclusively in Taiwan. The price of every consumer electronic device you buy in the year after a Strait disruption will rise. The wait time for every car at a dealership lot will lengthen the way it lengthened from 2021 to 2023, when the automotive chip shortage cost the United States automotive industry an estimated $210 billion in lost output per AlixPartners' published analysis. Multiply that disruption by 4, because the next disruption will not just hit automotive chips, it will hit the entire electronics and data center supply chain at once. The Boston Consulting Group's $1.5 trillion GDP loss estimate is what that arithmetic looks like at the macro level. At your household level, it looks like a $3,000 phone replacement getting pushed to $4,000 and waiting 4 months to arrive. Let me bring this back to ground, because I'd rather give you instruments than predictions. There are 4 things you can watch over the next 90 days that will tell you whether the 3 C's linkage is hardening or whether it is going to fragment back into the older separated pattern. First, watch whether any other NATO member runs a FONOP through the South China Sea before the end of the 3rd quarter. If Germany does, or France does, the precedent is established. If only the Dutch transit happens, it was a one-off, and the linkage stays soft. Second, watch the AIDC delivery cadence. AIDC delivery cadence. AIDC said the first 200 units would be delivered by the 4th quarter. If they hit that cadence, the deterrent is real and the Chinese electronic warfare calculation against Taiwan deteriorates from this year forward. If the deliveries slip, the announcement was political signaling more than operational reality. Third, watch the Quad statements. The next Quad Foreign Ministers meeting is in late July. If the joint statement explicitly references all 3 Cs, East China, Taiwan, South China, in a single paragraph, the linkage has been formally adopted at the diplomatic level. If the statement keeps them in separate paragraphs, Beijing's preferred framing has held. And fourth, watch the Shanghai Institute's quarterly update on its external risk index. If Taiwan stays at number 1 in the 3rd quarter publication, the assessment is durable. If it drops back below trade and technology, it was a temporary peak. So here is the case for it mattering, in a single sentence. The reason Beijing's window on Taiwan has been pushed further into the future for the last decade is precisely because the deterrent cost kept rising faster than Beijing's offensive capabilities. GPS-independent drones at fleet deployable cost, NATO-flagged FONOPs, and an in-house Chinese assessment placing the Strait at number 1 are 3 new line items on the deterrent cost side of the ledger, all added in the same 6 months. That does not mean the invasion is coming sooner. It means the invasion is now mathematically more expensive than it was 6 months ago, and Beijing's strategic planners are the ones who have to absorb that arithmetic. If the country that is supposed to be biding its time has just watched its number 1 external risk acquire a drone fleet that its own electronic warfare doctrine cannot jam, and its second most favored regional theater receive its first NATO flag transit, and its own most trusted policy intellectuals raise an alarm about the same body of water in writing, what exactly is the calculation that keeps the timeline patient? This is Professor Stephen. I'll see you in the next one.